Joseph's tomb is a funerary monument located at the eastern entrance to the valley that separates Mounts Gerizim and Ebal, 300 meters northwest of Jacob's Well, on the outskirts of the West Bank city of Nablus, near Tel Balata, the site of Sheikh Mu in the Late Bronze Age and later biblical Shechem. One biblical tradition identifies the general area of Shechem as the resting place of the biblical patriarch Joseph and his two sons Ephraim and Manasseh. Joseph's tomb has been venerated throughout the ages by Jews, Samaritans, Christians and Muslims. Post-biblical records regarding the location of Joseph's tomb at this site date from the beginning of the 4th century AD. The present structure, a small rectangular room with a cenotaph, dates from 1868, and is devoid of any trace of ancient building materials. While some scholars, such as Kenneth Kitchen and James K. Hoffmeyer, still affirm the essential historicity of the biblical account of Joseph, many others, such as Donald B. Redford, argue that the story itself has no basis in fact. Modern scholarship has yet to determine whether or not the present cenotaph is to be identified with the ancient biblical gravesite. No Jewish or Christian sources prior to the 5th century mention the tomb, and the structure originally erected over it appears to have been built by the Samaritans, for whom it was probably a sacred site. There is no archaeological evidence establishing the tomb to Joseph, and for this reason, the site is regarded as a relic tomb, established by later religious figures to reinforce a faith. At key points in its long history, Joseph's tomb has witnessed intense sectarian conflict, Samaritans and Christians disputing access and title to the site in the early Byzantine period, often engaged in violent clashes. After Israel captured the West Bank in 1967, Muslims were prohibited from worship at the shrine, and it was gradually turned into a Jewish prayer room. Interreligious friction and conflict from competing Jewish and Muslim claims over the tomb became frequent, falling under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian National Authority following the signing of the Oslo Accords. It remained under IDF guard, with Muslims prohibited from praying there. At the beginning of the Al-Aqsa Intifada in 2000, just after being handed over to the PNA, it was looted and razed by a Palestinian mob. Following the reoccupation of Nablus during Israel's Operation Defensive Shield in 2002, Jewish groups returned there intermittently. Between 2009 and 2010 the structure was refurbished, with a new cupola installed, and visits by Jewish worshippers have resumed. Early traditions. Biblical source and early religious traditions. The Torah provides 4 details regarding the traditions surrounding Joseph's remains. The account in Genesis relates that, before his death, he had his brothers swear they would carry his bones out of Egypt to Canaan. He is then said to have been embalmed, then placed in a coffin in Egypt. In Exodus, we are told that Moses fulfilled the pledge by taking Joseph's bones with him when he left Egypt. In Joshua, Joseph's bones are said to have been brought from Egypt by the children of Israel and interred in Shechem. The bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, were buried in Shechem in a parcel of land Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver. Joshua chapter 24 verse 32. The Bible does not identify a specific site in Shechem where his bones were laid to rest. The Genesis Rabbah, a Jewish text written c. 400–450 CE, states that a burial site in Shechem is one of 3 for which the nations of the world cannot ridicule Israel and say, "You have stolen it," having been purchased by Jacob. The rabbis also suggest that Joseph instructed his brothers to bury him in Shechem, since it was from there he was taken and sold into slavery. The ambiguity is reflected in Islamic tradition, which points to Nablus as being the authentic site, though some early Islamic geographers identified a cave of the patriarchs in Hebron as housing his tomb. The Quran itself does not mention details of Joseph's burial. Ali of Herat, Yaquit ibn Battuta all conserve both the Nablus and Hebron traditions. Later Muslim chroniclers also mention a third site purporting to be the authentic tomb, near Beit Ijza. The Hebron tradition is also reflected in some medieval Christian sources, such as the account by Sir Wolf, who says that the bones of Joseph were buried more humbly than the rest, as it were at the extremity of the castle. Modern scholarship on the narrative of Joseph's bones, though the traditional biblical date for the narrative of Joseph's life and death places him in Egypt in the middle of the 12th dynasty, roughly comparable to the Hyksos invasion of Egypt. Contemporary scholarship no longer accepts such a remote dating. The figure of Joseph itself is often taken to be a personification of a tribe, rather than an historic person. According to the Bible, Joseph was embalmed and buried in a coffin in Egypt, after having his people swear to carry his bones away. Later Midrash identify his first entombment in a royal mausoleum, or as cast into the Nile. Moses is said to have gathered the bones and taken them with him during the exodus from Egypt, using magic to raise the coffin, a tradition repeated by Josephus, who specifies that they were buried in Canaan at that time. Regarding his burial in Canaan, from Joshua it is evident that the portion Joseph received was an allotment near Shechem, not the town itself. The majority of contemporary scholars believe the historicity of the events in the Joseph story cannot be demonstrated. In the wake of scholars like Hermann Gunkel, Hugo Gressman and Gerhard von Rad, as a novella it is read as reworking legends and myths, many of them, especially the motifs of his reburial in Canaan, associated with the Egyptian god Osiris, though some compare the burial of his bones at Shechem with the disposal of Dionysus's bones at Delphi. The reworked legends and folklore were probably inserted into the developing textual tradition of the Bible between the 8th and 6th centuries BCE. Most scholars place its composition in a genre that flourished in the Persian period of the exile. For Schenker, the tradition of Joseph's burial at Shechem can only be understood as a secondary, Israelitic historical interpretation woven around a more ancient Canaanite shrine in that area. Wright has indeed argued that the patriarch Joseph was not an Israelite hero who became Egyptianized, but an Egyptian divinity who was Hebraized. Schenk's hypothesis. Hans Martin Schenker, starting from an analysis of John chapter 4 verses 4 to 6, in which Jesus encounters a Samaritan woman at the town Sychar, made an extensive analysis of the ancient sources, together with an examination of the site. The curiosity of the Gospel text for scholars lies in the mention of an otherwise unattested town in the field, and the failure of the text to refer to Joseph's tomb, despite mentioning the field Jacob allotted to Joseph, and Jacob's well. In Schenk's view, from the beginning of the Hellenistic period down to the 1st century CE, when the author of John's Gospel was presumably writing, the grave commemorating Joseph stood by Jacob's well. This grave was shifted, together with the sacred tree in Jacob's field,